You'll often hear AI systems referred to as black boxes, and that's because in science and computing, a black box can only be understood by its inputs and outputs, meaning we don't know how it actually works. What's more, the companies that build these AI systems tend to reveal very little about how they do so, even those inputs, like what kind of data was used to train them. Companies claim sharing this information might give away trade secrets and put them at a disadvantage. And new research from Stanford University suggests this lack of transparency is getting worse, even as the capabilities of these systems skyrocket and are trusted with ever more sensitive decisions. I'm Jennifer Strong, and this is Shift.
Now here on the steering column is a device called Auto Cruise. You simply set the speed you want.
Self-driving robo-taxis are already on the road in US cities.
As the disc rotates, a mirror reflects the light in the way that depends on how the signal was recorded.
This is the 100 terabyte Electro. I present to you Electro, the Moto Man. Ladies and gentlemen.
I would say that one of my greatest skills is my ability to interact with humans.
This episode, a look at AI transparency with Karen Howe from The Atlantic.
Because you're listening to this podcast, I'm assuming you're interested in staying on top of the latest trends, news, and more. So I want to tell you about another show. It's called Web3 with A6NC Crypto, but it's really about the future of the internet, future of creators, future of business, future of the way we work and live. It's for anyone seeking to understand the latest tech trends direct from experts with high insights per minute, given your time and attention are so valuable. Follow Web3 with A6NC in your podcast app now.
Hi, my name is Karen Howe, and I am a contributing writer for The Atlantic. And I am also working on a book for Penguin Press about the AI industry.
Researchers at Stanford University have been tracking the transparency of the major AI companies, and basically their new report failed everyone.
Exactly. So Stanford researchers developed this tracker where they were trying to just use a very basic checklist of 100 different criteria and whether or not different AI companies disclosed each of these 100 criteria. Basic information like, what is the model that you develop? What is the data that it's trained on? What are the wages that you're paying workers who are working on its development? When is the model supposed to be used and not supposed to be used? Like basic things like that. And all of the companies ended up getting an F. The highest score was 54 points out of 100 points, but the average score was 37. So this is a pretty dire industry-wide problem that we're seeing where not a single company is being transparent about the technology that they're building that is weaving its way into our lives.
I think it's worth noting, despite there being 100 criteria and everyone failing, not everybody thinks the bar is high enough in this report either.
Yes, that is true. There are multiple experts that I spoke to who mentioned that 100 criteria is, it sounds rigorous, but there are so many different criteria, so many different elements of an AI model, the inputs that you're putting into it, the impact that it's having on the other side that aren't tracked by this criteria. And some people criticized it, saying that the criteria actually should have been an even higher bar in demonstrating how dire this problem is. So it gives you a sense of the fact that the failure scores could actually be even worse if we were more comprehensive with this transparency tracker.
Maybe we should back up a moment and give a bit of the backstory, because this is not a new problem at all.
It's not a new problem. In fact, nearly a decade ago, the tech and legal scholar Frank Pasquale coined the phrase black box society to talk about the idea that tech companies were increasingly becoming more and more dominant forces within people's lives, and at the same time were giving less and less information about how they actually worked. So we've seen this with social media. We've seen this generally with how the internet works. These companies, as they privatize more and more of the technologies that are forming our communication, our information ecosystems, our relationship building, and now with AI technologies, things like our healthcare experiences, our educational experiences, they provide just no information for us to truly understand as consumers how we should be interfacing with this technology, whether we should trust the technology, and also as policymakers, how to regulate the technology, how to hold it accountable. So it has been a longstanding problem. And in some ways, this is kind of a double-edged sword. On one hand, we now have a lot of examples of how black box technologies can really erode trust and end up harming people. But on the other hand, Silicon Valley sort of made us used to this over 10 years of kind of curating and slowly edging us towards a more and more opaque experience with their technologies. So we've sort of reached this point now where we are in a world where AI technologies are more influential than ever before. And they are more deeply integrated into critical parts of our lives than ever before. And yet we haven't fully registered that we are kind of at the cusp of sort of a very dangerous formula here where we are allowing it to take over so many aspects without actually scrutinizing it sufficiently.
Something else that might be helpful here. Do you mind to explain what a foundation model is? Because I'm going to bet that's not clear to everybody listening.
Yeah, it's a good question because it's also a bit of a controversial term. So the way that Stanford defines a foundation model is a model that is trained on a broad swath of data and therefore can sort of generally do many different things. It's a multi-purpose AI technology. You can integrate it into a chatbot. You can ask it questions about math versus about chemistry versus about literature. But the part of the reason why it's critiqued is also that these technologies also don't work in every scenario. And by calling it foundation model, it makes it sound like it's a very foundational, all-knowing, all-seeing technology. But in fact, there are many, many different areas in which these technologies fail and many places in which they fail in ways that we haven't discovered yet, or we just don't really know. So that's sort of the intent behind this tracker, is to track these types of technologies that are aspirationally meant to be kind of the new backbone of our digital society. But then the criticism is that also maybe they shouldn't be, and maybe using this term actually normalizes that.
Were there any particular highlights from the report you think would be worth noting?
One of the things that I was personally surprised by was, so the report tracks 10 different companies, but these 10 companies have very different stances on transparency itself. There are some companies that part of their business model is selling the technology, the foundation model, through kind of a closed application programming interface or API, which means that if someone wants to build an app using some kind of, OpenAI technology in the background, they're paying OpenAI, and OpenAI sort of has a business incentive to not actually reveal that much about the technology because they don't want someone else to then recreate it. Like, that's sort of their secret sauce. It's their competitive advantage. But there are other companies within this 10 that are actually explicitly have come out saying that they stand for transparency, like Meta. So Meta has this model called Llama 2 that they specifically published online so that anyone can download it and start using it. And they have sort of positioned themselves as a company that really is trying to counteract this closed nature of AI development. And even Meta didn't do well in this tracker. Like, that was kind of surprising to me. And when I was talking with researchers to understand that, they were saying, well, the way that Meta approaches open sourcing its technologies is sort of the Silicon Valley approach to open sourcing. Like, they don't actually publish all of their code in a way where independent auditors can actually literally go through line by line and understand what the model is doing and how it was developed. They just publish the end results. So what Deb Raji, an AI accountability researcher, told me was, it's like you're getting a cake, but you don't actually know the recipe of the cake. You can add things to the cake, you can add layers, you can add decorations, but you can never recreate the cake. So even for Meta, which champions this kind of, we need more transparency, we need more openness, they ended up getting a 54 out of 100 points because they're just not actually revealing some of the more critical ingredients.
Is this the same everywhere? Is this like an American problem, or is it better in some places?
It is the same problem everywhere, in part because in this age that we're in now, there are only two big clusters of companies that develop these technologies. One is in the US and one is in China. And in China, it's the same picture. The main companies that develop big, quote unquote, foundation models are using the same exact playbook that American companies are. They are also selling the technologies through a closed application programming interface. They want to make money from the tool. And there is also an open source community within China that is connected with the global open source community that also is having similar debates within the Chinese tech ecosystem as we see in the US ecosystem, where certain people think that the closed source nature of the Chinese tech giants is also very problematic and are pushing against it. But the fact of the matter is that the companies, Alibaba, Baidu, ByteDance, Huawei, that are developing these tools are just as dominant as the Meta and Google and OpenAI of the US. So even if you wanted more transparency, if you want to use the technology, that's just what you're going to get. You're just going to get these secretive companies building the tools.
Is there a path forward in which this gets any better?
I think this is sort of a first step, and the transparency tracker is a first step to reminding people that A, this is a problem, and B, they sort of give a list of criteria of things that are providing an initial roadmap to consumers and to policymakers about what they should be asking, what kind of information they should be asking for. So now the question is, what can people and what can policymakers actually do with that information? And I think for consumers, it's a good exercise to go through the 100 criteria. It's all online, it's all readily readable, and it's very digestible, the report and the criteria. The researchers explain exactly why they chose every single criteria. And you can sort of read through, and it's almost like reading a nutrition label for food. You can understand what is actually the technologies that you're relying on and whether or not you want to rely on them, and start making decisions as a consumer about basically voting with your money, voting with your feet. For policymakers, I think it's actually like the lowest hanging fruit is actually just starting to mandate through regulation transparency. Like if policymakers are still trying to figure out, the nuances of how to regulate specific things like algorithmic bias or other elements like that, that's okay. We don't need to have a debate about whether these things need to be transparent. Like that can be the first step that policymakers take. And once we have sort of more of a baseline of information about these technologies, then we can start, informing other regulations and being more nuanced about downstream regulations. But just at a baseline, we should be requiring companies to reveal more about their tools.
It would feel like the least controversial thing about all of these discussions around regulation. Before we trust something with some critical decision, we should know whether it's possible that it will work as described.
Exactly. I mean, there are many other industries in which we do very heavily regulate the tools that are in, like the healthcare industry is heavily regulated. Companies have to prove that their technology works before, or like a drug company needs to prove that their drug works exactly as they say and has to go through rigorous trials, has to go through rigorous audit to make sure that ultimately a consumer isn't taking a drug just because a company inflated the efficacy or minimized the side effects of that drug. And we should be applying the same approach to AI, given how important it is and the types of functions that is starting to integrate into within anyone's life. That's sort of like the baseline that we really need to have the kind of protections to make sure that ultimately people aren't harmed or collectively we aren't harmed together. One of the other things that surprised me was all of the companies did particularly poorly in a group of criteria that the researchers called impact criteria. So specifically, did the companies disclose how these models are having downstream effects? Like how many users are using the technology, what kinds of applications are being built on top of this technology, and where is the technology geographically distributed? All of this is particularly important for policymakers because policymakers need to have this kind of roadmap to understand prioritization, like which industries should they be prioritizing their focus in thinking about regulation of AI technologies. But it's also really important for consumers, like this foundation model term. It's an aspirational term about these technologies being a foundational aspect of every part of your life. And your teacher could be using OpenAI technology to help with teaching your kid in class. OpenAI technology is also being integrated into healthcare applications, so it could be assisting your family doctor. And it could also be powering your office productivity tools because it's the same technology that is now being weaved into Microsoft's suite of tools. But you might not even know that all of these different aspects of your life are actually relying on this one company's technology because of this lack of transparency. And this is sort of what I mean when saying that we're sort of sleepwalking into this dangerous formula where right now when we use Google, at least we know that Google is the company that we are using. But with AI technologies, there's starting to be an even deeper level of secrecy where the face of the technology is actually not obviously being delivered to us by the company that it was created from.
We'll be back right after this.
Hackers and cybercriminals have always held this kind of special fascination.
Obviously, I can't tell you too much about what I do.
It's a game. Who's the best hacker? And I was like, well, this is child's play.
I'm Dina Temple-Raston, and on the Click Here podcast, you'll meet them and the people trying to stop them.
We're not afraid of the attack. We're afraid of the creativity and the intelligence of the human being behind it.
Click Here, stories about the people making and breaking our digital world.
AI machines. Satellite. Engine ignition.
Click Here.
And liftoff.
Every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts.
So one of the things that some people criticized about the transparency tracker is also that they didn't actually include this one particular example within the industry that is actually quite transparent and would score far higher than the models that they scored for the tracker. And this is a model called Bloom, and it was produced by what was called the Big Science Project, which was an international research collaboration that specifically tried to develop a large language model that is more transparent and has greater consent, and basically trying to develop practices around AI development that show a different approach to how we can develop these technologies. And one of the things that the researchers took a lot of care in doing was they conducted one of the few analyses available to date of broader environmental impacts around AI development. So they did like a carbon emissions analysis on Bloom, and they also looked at things like what other kinds of environmental resources were required to develop the computer chips that are used to train this technology. The researchers did a lot of documentation around who is producing the data that they trained on. Are they book authors? Are they artists? Was the data copyrighted? Is there personally identifiable information, and how did they treat it? And were there any other kinds of restrictions or other kinds of source material that a user of this Bloom model should ultimately know about? So this example kind of demonstrates it is totally possible to have this level of transparency. It's just that the companies have chosen not to do it. It's not that it's too hard or it's too costly. Like the big science project was done with primarily government funded resources. So it was done with far less money than many of these larger corporations have at their fingertips. So it's just a really important counterweight or counterexample to this closed off nature of AI development.
Do you know why it wasn't included?
So the Stanford researchers, they were trying to pick, they couldn't audit all of the models, so they were trying to pick one model per organization. So they ended up picking a different model for big science called Bloom's. But some critics say that they should have picked Bloom as actually this counter example because Bloom would have scored much higher than Bloom's with a Z. And the Stanford researchers just say that, their resources were limited. They had to pick one per organization and they chose Bloom's. But ultimately, this tracker is meant to be updated over time. This is not a one and done situation. They're going to continue auditing the models and these companies for transparency and seeing how they hopefully improve over time. And they might also incorporate more models as they go.
Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Jen.
This show is produced by me and Anthony Green with help from Emma Cillekens. It's mixed by Garret Lang with original music from him and Jacob Gorski. Thanks for listening. I'm Jennifer Strong.